Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to talk about books that I recommend all the time, the books that I recommend most consistently, in fact. This is a video that was inspired by versions of this that I saw from Jen the Librarian and Brian at Bookish. I will put links to both of their videos down below. I was a little hesitant to do this video at first because, to be honest, the way Jen the Librarian and the way Brian at Bookish do this is just the 5 books that they recommend the most. I talk about these 5 books that I recommend the most all the time. So for anyone who is familiar with this channel or who has been around for a while, these won't necessarily be new recommendations to you. So I was hesitant, but I've gotten a lot of new subscribers recently, specifically because of a video that I did on the 25 best books of the last 25 years. However, all 5 of my most recommended books are in that video. So I'm going to rush through the 5 that I most recommend and spend most of this video talking about other books, like outside of the top 5, that I recommend all the time or that I read recently that I think could end up in the mix, or that I just feel like I recommend a lot. And these will be more familiar to people who have been around with this channel for a while. So hopefully this won't be too boring for you. If it is, I promise you can take a skip on this video and come around for the next one. This is a little bit more for the people who are new here. Hi, how are you? My name is Greg. Hopefully you know that. But so let's start with the 5 books that I recommend the most. Again, I'm going to sort of power through these, and I'll have a link to the 25 best books of the last 25 years. Again, all of these books are featured in there, so you will hear a lot more about them there. The number one is, I don't, these are not ranked. They're just the books that I feel like I talk about the most on my channel. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Filia. I refer to this book as my beloved. Pretty much anytime it comes up, I love this book. It's a story collection. It is absolutely fantastic. And if you want to know why, here's just a quick thing. The Secret Lives of Church Ladies explores the raw and tender places where Black women and girls dare to follow their desires and pursue a momentary reprieve from being good. It is a fantastic book. I recommend it all the time, which is the point of this video. So check out the 25 best books of the last 25 years for more on that one, and for The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. This one in particular has come up a lot over the last year because it's been about a year since Demon Copperhead was released, and obviously since then I have been talking a lot about Barbara Kingsolver. She won the Pulitzer, or co-won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. I'll link my reaction video to that down below. And I love this book. I have loved this book since I first read it. It featured prominently in the 25 best books of the last 25 years, because in that I try to pick the best, and this factors into the top 5 and the top 2. It's a really great book. It's about a family in, I believe, the 1950s that immigrates to what at the time was known as, I believe, the Belgian Congo. And yeah, the Belgian Congo in 1959. It's there on the back. And they get there as missionaries and just realize they don't know what they're doing. They don't understand this culture that they have assumed that they are better than in some ways. And most of the book takes the perspective of the daughters, who are more, I don't want to say innocent, but are sort of beholden to the decisions of their parents. And it's a really fascinating, beautiful, brilliant book. Train Dreams by Dennis Johnson. This factored heavily into my video about the 2012 Pulitzer controversy, because this was one of the books that was a finalist for the Pulitzer that year. And it's the book that I think should have won. So not only is this in the 25 best books of the last 25 years, it is also in that 2012 Pulitzer controversy video, which I will also link down below. It's really great. It is about America and grief, and it's very small. You could easily read this book, and I just really, really love it a great deal. Louise Erdrich's The Plague of Doves. This was actually the first Louise Erdrich book that I read. I absolutely loved it. It was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. I feel like it's a good introduction to her work because, like many of her books, it deals with a sprawling cast of Native characters and their stories, and there are a lot of characters who appear or have already appeared in other stories, or at least their families have. So it's a good introduction. It uses a crime as a sort of hook to get you into the book, but it does not have the feel or tone of a mystery or thriller. And significantly, I would say less so than The Roundhouse, which almost feels like a mystery or a thriller. And while I really love Medicine, which was Louise Erdrich's first book, that book is a little more mystical and kind of magical realist, and this one is not. So great place to start if you haven't read Louise Erdrich. And then, of course, there's Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I know this is a bit of a cilantro book. There are a lot of people who did not enjoy this book as much as I did, but I really love it. I love the way the story unfolds throughout it. And it's one of those books, I think the less you know about it, the better the impact will be, because as the story sort of meanders its way to revelations about what is actually going on, it hits really hard. And it's hard because I know there has been a movie adaptation. People have talked about this book, so a lot of people know what it is actually about. But I think it's best to go in and sort of let the secrets of this book unfold. And I just absolutely love it. So those are the 5 books that I recommend the most on my channel. Again, if you follow along, you have heard a lot about them. If you came here because of that 25 best books of the last 25 years, you heard me talk about all of them in there. Let's move to other books that I recommend a lot, because I feel like this is going to get outside of books that I talk about a lot. And the first one is Night of the Living Rez by Morgan Talty. I really loved this book when I read it last fall. I still love it, but I backed off of recommending it a lot because a lot of people read this book toward the end of the year, and I didn't want to start sounding like a broken record when a lot of people were, at least in my corner of BookTube, were already reading this book. A lot of people read it for Indigithon, and I definitely didn't want to sound like a broken record. So I kind of backed off, but it has come up a lot. So I feel like this is a book that is probably going to be alongside my beloved The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, at least in the future, because I feel like this is a book I'm going to recommend a lot. It is sort of stories. It's linked stories. It almost kind of feels like a novel where each chapter is out of chronological order. I don't want to say too much about that, but it follows a Native man in Maine and his family and the struggles that they experience, the sort of generational traumas that they endure and the ways they survive. And it's a surprisingly funny book in a lot of places. And I will say in the beginning, it took a couple of stories or chapters to really get into the book and sort of realize what it was doing and what everything that was going on. And once I got over that hump, I was sold on this book pretty hard. And I think it really built to an extremely powerful, emotional conclusion. So if you have followed along, you remember last fall, I talked about this book a lot. I backed off a fair amount in 2023 because a lot of people were reading it. But this is definitely a book that I recommend a lot, and I think that I will continue to recommend a lot in the future, to the point where it might become one of the top 5 books that I recommend the most. And we'll just have to wait and see on that. But I absolutely love this book, and we'll continue talking about it a great deal. Another book that I read a long time before I had a BookTube channel. I don't know why I'm saying another book, because I haven't mentioned this before, but another book that I recommend all the time, but I didn't talk about on BookTube. I think that's what I meant. Because I read it a long time before I had a channel, is Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. It has come up recently, and I think it will continue to come up recently. A lot of people don't like short stories, and this is the collection that I point them to as a sort of access point. 1, because it's short. 2, because it's just really beautiful stories. It is a Pulitzer book. I'm thinking I might try to read it soon for my Pulitzer project, because Jhumpa Lahiri has a new book coming out. And I think, especially given that she has a book coming out, I feel like I keep returning to this well. So I did not talk about this book for a long time on my channel, and recently it's begun really picking up. It also factored into my best books of the last 25 years list. I just really love this. So these are stories about immigration and cultural disconnection and America, because a lot of the Indian families in these stories have relocated, and they are experiencing that distance from their home and the culture that they are familiar with, and there is the distance between the parents who immigrated and the children who are growing up in the United States, and the sort of gulf that exists between them. And that's not a new topic, but I think the way Jhumpa Lahiri writes about it is absolutely gorgeous. And if you have ever read a Jhumpa Lahiri book, you know that she is just a staggeringly beautiful writer. Her prose is elegant and just shining and beautiful and piercing in a lot of subtle ways. And Interpreter of Maladies is probably the book that gets that across the best, which is really surprising because it is also her debut. She is one of the people who won a Pulitzer Prize for a debut. And I just love her work. I have read everything that she has put out in the realm of fiction, and I will continue to do so. I'm really looking forward to reading Roman Stories, which is coming later this year. And I am hoping to do a Pulitzer Prize deep dive on this somewhere around the time that Roman Stories is released, but I don't want to promise anything. So that should be coming. It's just a really beautiful book. Again, it's short. It is 198 pages, so it's just under 200 pages. Absolutely a fantastic book that I cannot recommend enough, and that I feel like, again, I did not have occasion to talk about for a while on my channel, but it feels like it's been popping up a lot more recently and will probably continue to do so in the future. Then we get to Now in November by Josephine Johnson. I read this as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. I read this because someone sent me a link to an article discussing the idea that Josephine Johnson, who, by the way, was also a debut writer. She, like Jhumpa Lahiri, won a Pulitzer Prize for her debut novel. She is the youngest person to have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. But she may have lost her publishing deal with her publisher for having ties to socialism as part of sort of a Red Scare. Basically, she was blacklisted. That is the implication. It's not black and white. I did a whole video on that after I read the book. I will link it down below. But Now in November is a really beautiful book that I keep bringing up because I think it's just a really beautiful family story. It's a story that is pretty deeply about the Great Depression. Great Depression. I said Grape Depression because the grapes of wrath. I don't know. Anyway, it is very much about the Great Depression, although it doesn't really name all of the financial things that are going on as the Great Depression, from what I remember. But it feels very timely now. Anyone who has struggled with like mortgage payments can really relate to what the family in this book is going through. And it's a beautiful, spare story that focuses on the family. It's really observant. It's very humane and empathetic. I really deeply love it. And for that reason, I feel like this is another book that is on the rise in my estimation, where I will continue talking about it for a long time to people and pointing them back toward this book. It was republished a year or two ago in this rather beautiful, I think, edition with this cover. I actually have a Franklin Library edition. I read the Franklin Library edition of the book when I did my Pulitzer Prize video about this book, but I wanted to have this copy because it's a really pretty cover, for one thing, but also I really wanted to sort of, it's weird to say reward the publisher for reissuing this, but I definitely wanted to throw some weight in this direction to say, like, yes, this is an author that I hope other books of hers will be republished. They also did an edition of The Inland Island, which is one of my favorite books from this year. It's a nonfiction book by Josephine Johnson, and also was re-released with a stunningly beautiful cover. So I'm hoping that there will be more of that in the future. So I wanted to make sure I got a copy of this to say, like, hey, yes, I am interested in this. Hopefully a lot of other people are as well. And I think especially as I work my way through my Pulitzer Prize project, I will continue to point people in this direction, because if you haven't read Now in November, definitely discover this book. I feel like this book is poised for rediscovery because there are people like Kim from Middle of the Book March who have also read this and really loved it and done a lot of good work to push this book out into the popular consciousness. I'm hoping that takes off, but I have no control over that other than, telling you here that this is a really great book that was largely forgotten for a very long time and which I hope people rediscover and which I hope earns classic status. It definitely deserves that, I would say. Then we have Homegoing by Yad Gyasi, which I talked about in my 25 best books of the last 25 years. This is an interesting book because it was released the same year as The Underground Railroad. It was actually released first. I think I was reading this book when Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead was published, and it feels like everyone latched onto Colson Whitehead. Maybe because the publisher put more marketing behind that book, also because it was blessed by Oprah, and I feel like everybody just sort of didn't notice Homegoing, and I was actually really bitter at the time because I prefer Homegoing, and I like Underground Railroad a lot, but I prefer this book. So it was a little hard to see all of the attention that year go to The Underground Railroad when I thought, it's like, this book is right here. I think it's better. I don't begrudge The Underground Railroad its success, but I definitely felt bitter at the time. I did not have a BookTube channel to talk about that. But yeah, so I have been pointing people toward this book on and off. And again, recently, I feel like it's been coming up a fair amount more. This is sort of in an interesting place, like Night of the Living Rez. It is not a story collection or linked stories. It's a novel that is told in a very interesting way. Basically, in the beginning, you were introduced to two half-sisters in Africa in, what year is it? The 18th century. And one of them is captured and sold into slavery in the United States. The other one stays in Ghana and marries. And then every chapter after that jumps ahead one generation. And every chapter alternates back and forth between the descendants of the half-sister who goes to the United States and forcibly, I feel it's worth mentioning, and the half-sister who remains in Africa. And what you get is sort of a history of enslavement and what it does to the people, but it also shows the ramifications on the land and society and cultures on both sides of the ocean, not just the ramifications in the United States, but in Africa. And that is really fascinating, and it is told very well. I love this book. I recommend it to a lot of people, and that is why it is coming up here in this video, and I hope that more people will continue to discover it as well. A book that I read, I think 2 years ago, is Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian. I have been recommending it a lot ever since. This is a young adult book that is set in the 1980s. It is about a love triangle between two boys, teenagers, and a girl. Basically, there's a sort of romantic interest between one of the boys and the girl, and she has a gay friend, and then a romance blossoms between the boys, and it's sort of complicated, but it's also very much about coming of age and coming into political consciousness in a really fraught time. The AIDS epidemic was happening, and it's a really beautiful, well-told book. I have since read Only This Beautiful Moment by Abdi Nazemian, and I also really just loved that book. And I will be shocked if Only This Beautiful Moment doesn't also become a book that I recommend all the time to people. But I just love this book. People tend to think that it's a graphic novel when I hold up the cover, but it is. It's not. It's not. But it's a really great young adult novel that you can read at any age and appreciate. And I think one of the things that hit me so much about this is that I'm a couple of years younger than the protagonists of this book, but I am close enough to it that I came of age in a sort of similar fashion. And it just felt very poignant to me, and I think it would be relevant for a lot of younger people to read, to understand what it was like to be young at that time. and in a very confusing situation, and all of the political turmoil that was happening then and has been happening since. It's a really great book that I recommend all the time and will continue to recommend. A book I don't actually own a copy of, but which I recommend a lot since I read it earlier this year, is Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Since I read it, I have been collecting Edna Ferber books because I want to read all of them. She is in the Pulitzer family of authors. She won for a book called So Big, and I haven't read it yet, but I want to try to get to that one fairly quickly because I really loved Fanny Herself. It is... I think it's the book that should have won the first Pulitzer Prize for fiction, but it's another book that I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten. It's a forgotten classic. People loved it at the time, and then Edna Ferber is much less known today than she was 100 years ago, and I think that's a shame. I hope more people will rediscover her work, because Fanny Herself, and I know the name Fanny is really funny. If you are in the UK, there's nothing I can do about that. It is what it is. But this is a book that feels as urgent today as it would have back then. And that is one of the things that is really interesting about it. I did a whole video about this book and what I love about it. I'll link it down below. But this is definitely something that I really hope more people will discover, and that, like Now in November, it will become a rediscovered classic, something that we can reclaim and celebrate as we move forward, because I think it's really smart. I think it's really human and empathetic, and it just all of the things that I love about literature you can find in Fanny Herself. It's really good. And then the final book I want to mention in this video is Whose Names Are Unknown by Sonora Babb, another book I discovered just this year, but which I think I will continue pointing people toward. So this one I talk about a fair amount in my Pulitzer Prize deep dive on The Grapes of Wrath, which will be linked down below, because there's a really interesting link between Whose Names Are Unknown and The Grapes of Wrath, and I won't get into it here because it's the whole focus of my Pulitzer Prize deep dive. So if you want more information about that, check out the video. And actually, I also included it in my 25 best books of the last 25 years, because the story of The Grapes of Wrath and this actually really, it involves that. So this book ended up not being published in the 1930s. The Grapes of Wrath was published in 1939. And this probably would have been published in 1940 or 1941, but its publication ended up being canceled because of the success of The Grapes of Wrath. And there's a more direct link between the two books in the video. But it was only published in 2004 or 2005, so it kind of fit into the window. But again, like Now in November, this is just a very great human story about... It focuses on humans in the larger context of history, which I think is really interesting and a great way of looking at it. I actually prefer Whose Names Are Unknown to The Grapes of Wrath, which is a really tremendous and great book. But I feel like every time I talk about The Grapes of Wrath, I am going to bring this book up now, which is one way I feel like it is going to become one of my most recommended books, especially as I work my way through the Pulitzer Prize project. But also, I just love it. And I, again, hope that it is something like Now in November, like Fanny Herself, that people will discover and that will earn a place in the canon of American classics, because I think it would definitely deserve that. So those are my 5 most recommended books, and then a couple of books that I don't talk about as much, but recommend all the time. And I am thinking that what I'm going to do at some point is do another video about books that I really love but don't recommend enough, so stay tuned for that. I haven't really thought about what books those would be, but I know there are books that I really love and just have not had occasion to discuss, like Interpretive Maladies, a book that I loved for many years and just didn't have occasion to talk about until recently. So I'll think about that as well. Stay tuned for that. But I would love to hear what books you recommend the most. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.